Between 1847 and 1853, exactly 278 women vanished from religious revival camps across the remote hills of western Pennsylvania. Not died, not ran away, simply vanished. Their names were methodically erased from church records, their belongings distributed to charity, their families told they had been called to serve God elsewhere. For over a century, this systematic erasure remained buried in forgotten church archives until a demolition crew discovered something beneath the floorboards of the abandoned New Light Methodist camp in Clearfield County. That made local authorities seal the site for 3 months. What they found challenges everything we thought we knew about American religious history and reveals a doctrine so disturbing that 3 separate denominations worked together to hide it from the world. Before we continue with the story of the New Light Methodist camp and the doctrine that consumed hundreds of women, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now because this story has been suppressed for over 170 years, and there are forces that still don't want it told. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this darkness spread far beyond Pennsylvania, and you might be surprised how close it came to your hometown. The truth about what happened in those camps begins not with the disappearances, but with the man who called himself Brother Ezekiel Morai and the religious awakening that would become America's most carefully hidden nightmare. In the spring of 1847, the hill country of western Pennsylvania was experiencing what locals called the Great Stirring, a religious revival that burned through isolated communities like wildfire through dry timber. Unlike the organized camp meetings of the Second Great Awakening, this movement emerged from the shadows of Appalachian valleys where denominations blended and ancient beliefs mixed with Christian doctrine in ways that would have horrified seminary professors in Philadelphia or Boston. The region itself seemed designed for secrets. Dense forests of pine and oak stretched for miles, without roads broken only by narrow valleys where small communities had carved out existences, far from the watchful eyes of established churches. German Lutheran, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and Welsh Methodists had settled these hills in the 1790s, but by 1847 their descendants practiced a hybrid faith that borrowed from old country traditions their grandparents had brought across the Atlantic. Into this spiritual wilderness came Brother Ezekiel Morai, a man whose past was as mysterious as his doctrine. He claimed to be a former seminary student from Princeton who had received divine visions in the wilderness, though no records of his attendance were ever found. What mattered to the hill people wasn't his credentials, but his power. When Brother Morai preached, women fainted, men wept, and children spoke in tongues. He could heal the sick with a touch, predict the weather with uncanny accuracy, and most importantly, he could read the spiritual condition of a person's soul with disturbing precision. Morai's message was simple yet revolutionary. Traditional Christianity had been corrupted by man-made institutions. True salvation could only be achieved through complete surrender to God's will, as interpreted by those blessed with divine insight. He called his movement the New Light, not to be confused with the earlier New Light movement of the 1740s, but something entirely distinct and infinitely more dangerous. The New Light Methodist camp was established in the summer of 1847 on a remote plateau overlooking the Little Toby Creek, about 12 miles northeast of what would later become the town of Clearfield. The site was chosen for its isolation, accessible only by a narrow mountain trail that wound through 3 miles of unmarked forest. Local families donated materials and labor, viewing the camp as a beacon of spiritual renewal in their difficult lives. The camp's layout followed Brother Morai's specific instructions. A central meeting hall built of rough-hewn logs dominated the compound, its interior deliberately kept dim to focus the soul inward. Surrounding it were smaller cabins for families, a separate dormitory for unmarried women, and Brother Morai's private retreat built into the hillside like a cave dwelling. Most unusually, the entire camp was surrounded by an 8-foot wooden fence, ostensibly to keep out wild animals, but designed in a way that made it nearly impossible to climb from the inside. The first families to join the camp were the Weatherbys, Pennsylvania Dutch farmers, who had lost 2 children to typhoid the previous winter. Sarah Weatherby, a 34-year-old mother of 6, would become the first woman to disappear under what Brother Morai called divine translation. Her husband Abraham later told authorities that Sarah had been called to serve God in a higher capacity and seemed genuinely to believe this explanation, even as his remaining children asked when their mother would return. The camp's rules were strict, but not unusual for religious communities of the era. Men and women were separated except during worship services. Personal possessions were shared among the community. Most importantly, absolute obedience to Brother Morai's spiritual guidance was required, as he alone possessed the divine insight necessary to interpret God's will for each individual soul. What made the New Light Camp different from other religious communities was Brother Morai's doctrine of spiritual elevation. According to his teachings, certain individuals, almost exclusively women between the ages of 16 and 40, were chosen by God for special service that required them to transcend their earthly attachments. The process of achieving this transcendence was kept secret from the general community, known only to Brother Morai and his inner circle of 3 male assistants he called Vessels of Light. By the winter of 1847, the camp housed 43 families, approximately 180 people total. The community was largely self-sufficient, growing their own food, making their own clothes, and maintaining only minimal contact with the outside world. Children were educated within the camp, learning, reading, and writing from the Bible, and from Brother Morai's own spiritual writings, which he claimed were divinely inspired. The isolation that made the camp spiritually pure also made it legally invisible. Pennsylvania's frontier counties had minimal law enforcement, and religious communities were generally left to govern themselves as long as they caused no trouble for their neighbors. The New Light Camp paid its taxes, traded fairly with local merchants, and its members seemed happy and well cared for during their rare visits to nearby settlements. But beneath the surface of this spiritual paradise, something was already beginning to stir. Sarah Weatherby had been gone for 3 months when her sister Mary arrived at the camp in December 1847, demanding to know what had happened to her sibling. Brother Morai met with Mary privately, and after their conversation, she emerged pale and shaken, telling her husband they must leave immediately. They departed that same night, abandoning Mary's personal belongings and refusing to speak of what she had learned. The first systematic disappearance occurred on the night of January 15, 1848, during what Brother Morai called a night of revelation. The event had been building for weeks, with increasingly intense prayer sessions and private consultations between Brother Morai and select women in the community. The atmosphere in the camp had grown electric with anticipation, though most residents didn't understand what they were anticipating. Rebecca Stoltzwis, a 19-year-old newlywed from Lancaster County, had been marked for spiritual elevation 3 days earlier. Her husband Jacob, a skilled carpenter who had helped build many of the camp structures, was told that his wife had been chosen for a great honor, but that he must demonstrate his faith by accepting God's will without question. Rebecca herself seemed to glow with an inner light that week, spending hours in prayer and speaking often of visions she claimed to be receiving. The night of revelation began at sunset, with the entire community gathered in the central meeting hall. Brother Morey preached for nearly 3 hours about the necessity of complete surrender to divine will, using passages from the Old Testament about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac and the prophets who give up everything to serve God. The congregation worked itself into a frenzy of religious ecstasy, with many speaking in tongues and others falling to the floor in apparent divine possession. At precisely 1000 p.m., Brother Morai called Rebecca forward. She walked to the front of the hall as if in a trance, her face serene and her eyes fixed on something beyond the visible world. Brother Morai placed his hands on her shoulders and spoke words in what he claimed was the ancient Hebrew tongue, though several witnesses later noted that the sounds didn't resemble any known language. Sister Rebecca has been chosen, Brother Morai announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. She will ascend to serve God in a capacity that transcends earthly understanding. Let no one question this calling, for it comes from the Almighty Himself. Rebecca turned to face the congregation, her voice clear and steady. I go willingly to serve the Lord in whatever capacity He requires. Do not mourn for me, for I am not dying, but being born into a higher existence. Trust in Brother Morday's wisdom, for he alone can guide you toward the light. The ceremony continued until nearly midnight with increasingly intense prayers and what Brother Morday called soul preparation rituals. Finally, Rebecca was led from the hall by Brother Morday and his 3 assistants. The congregation was instructed to remain in prayer until dawn, allowing their sister to complete her transition without earthly interference. When the sun rose on January 16th, Rebecca Stoltzfoss was gone. Her husband Jacob was told that she had been taken up by God to serve in a higher realm, similar to how Enoch had been taken up in the Old Testament. Her personal belongings were distributed among the community, and her name was formally removed from the camp's records. Jacob was encouraged to see her departure as a blessing, proof that God considered his wife worthy of the highest service. But Jacob Stoltz was not as easily convinced as Abraham Weatherby had been. That night, he attempted to search the camp for any sign of his wife, only to find his way blocked by Brother Morday's assistants. They explained gently but firmly that his lack of faith was hindering his spiritual development, and that continued questioning would only bring darkness to the community. The next morning, Jacob discovered that his tools had been moved from his workshop to the camp's common storage area. When he asked about this, he was told that since he was no longer married, he needed to demonstrate his commitment to community life by sharing all his possessions. More disturbing, he found that his sleeping quarters had been reassigned to the unmarried men's dormitory, and his previous cabin was being prepared for a new family. Jacob's growing suspicions were shared by several other community members, particularly those who had known Rebecca well. Martha Brennan, a 45-year-old widow who had become something of a mother figure to the younger women, began asking uncomfortable questions about the translation process. She pointed out that while the Bible mentioned Enoch being taken up by God, it also made clear that such events were extraordinarily rare and accompanied by unmistakable divine signs. Brother Morai's response to these questions was swift and decisive. During the next Sunday service, he delivered a sermon about the dangers of doubt and the way Satan used seemingly reasonable questions to undermine faith. He spoke specifically about how those who question God's chosen servants were really questioning God himself, and how such doubt could spread like a disease through a community. The sermon had its intended effect. Martha Brennan found herself increasingly isolated with other community members, avoiding her for fear of being associated with doubt. Jacob Stoltzfus was assigned to increasingly menial tasks and excluded from the camp's decision-making councils. The message was clear: question the translations and you question God himself. But the questions didn't disappear. They went underground, whispered in private conversations between trusted friends. Several women began paying closer attention to who was being prepared for spiritual elevation and noticed disturbing patterns. The chosen women were always young, always attractive, and always seemed to enter a trance-like state in the days before their translation. More troubling, they often spoke of visions that seemed to focus on themes of surrender and submission rather than the typical religious imagery of heaven and salvation. The camp's isolation, which had once seemed like a blessing, now felt ominous. The 8-foot fence that kept wild animals out also kept secrets in. The narrow mountain trail that protected them from worldly corruption also made it nearly impossible for anyone to leave quickly or call for outside help. And Brother Morai's complete control over information meant that the outside world knew nothing of what was happening in the remote hills of Pennsylvania. As winter deepened, the disappearances began to accelerate. In February 1848, 2 more women were translated, Sisters Anna and Elizabeth Kaufman, ages 22 and 24. In March, it was Mary O'Sullivan, a 30-year-old Irish immigrant, who had joined the camp with her elderly parents. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: a period of spiritual preparation, a night of revelation ceremony, and then complete erasure from the camp's records. By spring, the camp had developed what could only be described as a culture of fear disguised as faith. Community members had learned not to ask questions, not to express doubts, and certainly not to investigate the growing number of empty cabins. The official explanation was always the same: these blessed women had been chosen for higher service, and questioning their fate demonstrated a lack of faith that could endanger one's own soul. The systematic erasure of these women from camp records was no accident. It was the cornerstone of what Brother Morai called the doctrine of sacred silence. According to his teachings, speaking about those who had been translated would interfere with their spiritual work in the higher realm and could even draw them back to earthly concerns, undermining their divine mission. This doctrine served multiple purposes beyond simple concealment. It created a culture where questioning became synonymous with sin, where doubt was literally heretical, and where the very act of investigating disappearances was framed as an attack on God himself. Community members learned to self-censor, to avoid conversations that might lead to dangerous questions, and to report any expressions of doubt to Brother Morai's assistants. The 3 men who served as Brother Morai's inner circle, known as the Vessels of Light, were crucial to maintaining this system. Jeremiah Whitmore, a former Methodist circuit rider from Ohio, handled the camp's external communications and business dealings. His warm smile and genuine religious knowledge made him the perfect ambassador to the outside world, and his letters to families of the missing women were masterpieces of misdirection and false reassurance. Samuel Brennan, Martha Brennan's own nephew, managed the camp's internal discipline and record-keeping. His intimate knowledge of each family's dynamics made him invaluable for identifying potential troublemakers and crafting personalized approaches to maintaining their silence. The fact that he was Martha's nephew also meant that even she hesitated to voice her suspicions too loudly. The 3rd assistant, Daniel Yoda, was responsible for what Brother Morai called spiritual counseling, private sessions with community members to assess their faith and loyalty. Yoda had an uncanny ability to detect doubt and dissent, often identifying potential problems before they became open rebellion. His sessions were conducted in complete privacy, and community members learned to dread being called to meet with him. By the summer of 1848, the camp's demographics had shifted dramatically. The original 43 families had dwindled to 31, with several families quietly leaving after their daughters or wives were selected for translation. More troubling, the ratio of women to men had become severely imbalanced, with many more single men than single women remaining in the community. This imbalance led to the introduction of what Brother Morty called spiritual marriages, unions blessed by God but not recognized by earthly authorities. These arrangements allowed the camp to bring in new women from outside communities, often young women fleeing difficult family situations or seeking spiritual fulfillment. The spiritual marriages were presented as temporary arrangements, with the understanding that truly faithful women would eventually be called to higher service through translation. The recruitment of new women became increasingly sophisticated. Brother Morai would send his assistants to revival meetings and camp gatherings throughout western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and northern West Virginia. They looked for specific types of women, those who were spiritually seeking, socially isolated, or economically desperate. The assistants would befriend these women, share carefully crafted stories about the spiritual paradise they had found, and gradually draw them into the camp's web. Martha Brennan, despite her growing suspicions, found herself in an impossible position. Her nephew Samuel was one of Brother Mordai's trusted assistants, and leaving the camp would mean abandoning him to whatever darkness she feared was growing there. More importantly, she had nowhere else to go. Her husband had died of tuberculosis 2 years earlier. Her children lived hundreds of miles away, and her life savings had been contributed to the camp's common fund when she joined. The spring of 1849 brought a new development that would prove crucial to understanding the camp's true nature. A young woman named Catherine Muller arrived at the camp, claiming to be fleeing an abusive husband in Pittsburgh. Catherine was different from the previous recruits. She was educated, literate, and had connections to the outside world that made her potentially dangerous. Brother Morai seemed immediately fascinated by Catherine, spending hours in private consultation with her and rapidly advancing her status within the camp's hierarchy. Within weeks, she was being prepared for spiritual elevation. But something went wrong with the usual process. Catherine began experiencing what she called dark visions, prophetic dreams that seemed to contradict Brother Mordai's teachings and suggest that the translated women were not serving God in a higher realm. The night before Catherine's scheduled translation ceremony, she approached Martha Brennan with a request that would change everything. She asked Martha to help her search Brother Mordai's private quarters for evidence of what had really happened to the other women. Catherine claimed her visions had shown her specific locations where proof could be found, and she was convinced that one night of investigation could expose the truth. Martha initially refused, terrified of the consequences if they were caught, but Catherine's desperation and the accumulation of her own doubts finally overcame her fear. The two women agreed to meet at midnight when the camp would be asleep, and Brother Mordai would be conducting his private communion with the divine, a nightly ritual that kept him occupied for hours. What they discovered in Brother Morai's quarters would haunt Martha Brennan for the rest of her life and provide the first concrete evidence of what had really happened to the 278 women who vanished from religious camps across Pennsylvania between 1847 and 1853. But their investigation would also set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the most carefully orchestrated cover-up in American religious history, involving not just Brother Morai's New Light movement, but established churches, local authorities, and powerful interests that reached all the way to the Pennsylvania state capitol. The search of Brother Morai's quarters began at 12:30 a.m. on June 3, 1849, when Martha Brennan and Catherine Muller crept through the camp's sleeping darkness toward the hillside retreat. The building was unlike any other structure in the camp, built partially underground with thick stone walls and only one entrance. What struck both women immediately was the absolute silence that surrounded the building, as if even the night sounds of the forest avoided the place. Catherine had insisted on bringing a small lantern despite the risk of detection, claiming her visions had shown her that they would need to examine written documents. Martha carried a set of master keys she had stolen from her nephew Samuel's quarters, keys that supposedly opened every lock in the camp for emergency purposes. The first room they entered appeared to be a normal study, shelves lined with religious texts, a simple wooden desk, and a narrow bed. But Catherine led Martha directly to a section of the wall that looked identical to the rest, running her hands along the stones until she found a concealed latch. When the hidden door swung open, both women were hit by a smell that made them gag, a mixture of damp earth, decay, and something else they couldn't identify. The hidden chamber was larger than the main room, carved directly into the hillside. The walls were covered with detailed drawings and writings that seemed to chronicle the fate of every woman who had been translated. But these weren't religious texts or spiritual testimonies. They were methodical records of what Brother Maury called the harvesting process. Martha's hands shook as she held the lantern while Catherine read from a leather-bound journal. The entries were written in Brother Maury's precise handwriting, each one documenting a woman's preparation for translation. The preparations involved weeks of isolation, specialized diets, and what the journal called spiritual conditioning, a process that seemed designed to break down the women's will and sense of reality. The most disturbing entries described the translation ceremonies themselves. What the community witnessed in the meeting hall was apparently only the beginning. After the women were led away, they were brought to this hidden chamber for what Brother Maury called the final elevation. The journal entries became increasingly cryptic when describing this process, but they made clear that the women were not being taken to serve God in any traditional sense. Catherine discovered a second journal that contained correspondence between Brother Maury and individuals identified only by initials. The letters discussed shipments and deliveries to locations in New York, Philadelphia, and as far south as Charleston. The correspondence wrote about quality merchandise and specialized training in language that made both women's blood run cold. But the most shocking discovery was a detailed map of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, marked with the locations of dozens of religious camps, revival sites, and isolated communities. Each location was annotated with numbers representing how many women had been harvested, and notes about the local authorities who had been brought into cooperation with the operation. The New Light Methodist camp was just one node in a network that stretched across 3 states. Other camps were operated by different religious leaders, all apparently connected to the same underlying organization. The map showed transportation routes, safe houses, and what appeared to be final destinations for the women who had been taken. Martha realized with growing horror that they had discovered evidence of what could only be described as a massive human trafficking operation, one that used religious communities as collection points and spiritual doctrine as a control mechanism. The women weren't being killed. They were being prepared for something worse. Something that required them to be psychologically broken and completely separated from their previous lives. As they continued to search the chamber, Catherine found a collection of personal items that had belonged to the translated women. Jewelry, locks of hair, and small mementos that had been carefully preserved. Brother Maury had apparently kept trophies from each woman arranged in a shrine-like display that suggested an obsession that went far beyond simple criminal enterprise. The final discovery was a schedule indicating that the next major harvesting was planned for the summer of 1849, with 12 women already selected for translation. Catherine's own name was at the top of the list, followed by Martha's. The realization that they had both been marked for removal sent them into a panic that nearly led to their detection. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Catherine insisted on taking several key documents as evidence. Martha begged her to leave everything undisturbed, fearing that Brother Maury would realize they had been discovered. Their argument was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the building. Brother Maury's nightly communion was ending earlier than usual. The 2 women barely managed to escape through a window, leaving behind the lantern and several documents Catherine had scattered in her haste. They spent the rest of the night in Catherine's cabin, planning their escape from the camp and debating whether to contact authorities or simply flee to safety. Their decision was made for them the next morning when Brother Maury announced during the breakfast gathering that Sister Catherine had received a powerful vision during the night, one that required immediate translation. The ceremony would be held that very evening, with no time for the usual preparation period. Martha realized that their nocturnal investigation had been discovered and that Catherine's accelerated translation was actually her execution. But when she tried to warn Catherine, she discovered that the younger woman had vanished from her cabin sometime before dawn. A search revealed that all of Catherine's personal belongings had been removed and other community members were already being told that she had been called away on urgent spiritual business. The speed with which Catherine had been disappeared demonstrated the efficiency of the operation Martha had uncovered. Brother Maury's network could identify threats, neutralize them, and cover up the evidence within hours. The realization that she might be next sent Martha into a desperate search for allies within the camp, only to discover that most of the remaining families were too frightened or too indoctrinated to help. Her nephew Samuel's reaction to her carefully worded questions convinced Martha that he was fully aware of the camp's true nature. His gentle suggestion that she might need spiritual counseling to address her recent troubles made it clear that she had been marked for special attention from Daniel Yoda, the assistant who specialized in identifying and dealing with potential problems. Martha's situation was now desperate. Catherine was gone, possibly dead, and the evidence of the trafficking operation was still hidden in Brother Morai's chamber. She had no allies in the camp, no way to contact outside authorities, and no means of escape that wouldn't immediately alert the camp's leadership to her intentions. But Catherine's disappearance had one unintended consequence. It confirmed Martha's suspicions and gave her the motivation she needed to risk everything in an attempt to expose the truth. If the women who had been translated were really being sold into slavery or worse, then someone had to speak for them, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. The question was how to get evidence to the outside world when she was trapped in an isolated camp surrounded by people who would report any suspicious activity to Brother Morai's assistants. The answer would come from an unexpected source, a secret that Catherine had shared with her during their brief partnership, one that would ultimately bring down the entire network. Martha's chance for escape came 3 days later when Brother Morai announced that the entire camp would participate in a special cleansing fast to prepare for what he called the final harvest. All community members were required to remain in their quarters for meditation and prayer, with meals suspended for 3 days. The assistants would patrol the camp to ensure spiritual discipline was maintained, but their routes were predictable, and Martha had been observing them carefully. More importantly, the fast provided cover for unusual behavior. If she was seen moving around the camp at odd hours, she could claim to be seeking solitude for deeper prayer. If she appeared weak or disoriented, it would be attributed to the spiritual effects of fasting. The fast also meant that Brother Morai and his assistants would be focused on maintaining control over the entire community, giving her the opportunity she needed to return to the hidden chamber. On the night of June 7th, Martha made her way back to Brother Morai's quarters. The building was dark, and she could hear the low murmur of his voice from the main room, suggesting he was conducting one of his private rituals. Using Catherine's technique, she found the hidden door and slipped into the chamber, this time prepared with a small candle and several cloth bags to carry documents. What she found in the chamber had changed since her first visit. The shrine of personal items had been expanded to include Catherine's jewelry, confirming Martha's worst fears about the young woman's fate. More disturbing, new entries had been added to the journal, including detailed notes about Martha's own behavior and psychological profile. Brother Morai had been studying her, planning her eventual translation with the same methodical approach he used for all his victims. But Martha also found something Catherine had missed in their hurried first search: a loose floorboard that concealed a cache of correspondence with what appeared to be the operation's leadership. The letters were signed with the initials JR and postmarked from Philadelphia. They discussed the camp's productivity and provided instructions for expanding the network into new territories. The most revealing letter was dated just 2 weeks earlier and contained specific instructions for dealing with the Brennan problem. The writer demonstrated detailed knowledge of Martha's suspicions and recommended that she be processed immediately to prevent any risk of exposure. The letter also mentioned that the Mueller asset had been compromised and would need to be retired before her scheduled delivery. Martha realized that Catherine's appearance at the camp had not been coincidental. She had been sent by someone connected to the operation, possibly as an infiltrator or test of the camp's security. Her dark visions and knowledge of the hidden chambers suggested she had been given inside information, but something had gone wrong with her mission, leading to her own capture and disappearance. The implications were staggering. If the operation was sophisticated enough to plant agents within its own network, it suggested a level of organization and resources that went far beyond what a single religious leader could command. The network was being managed by professionals who understood intelligence gathering, psychological manipulation, and law enforcement evasion. As Martha continued reading, she discovered that the operation's reach extended into established churches, local government, and even federal agencies. Several letters mentioned cooperative arrangements with judges, sheriffs, and immigration officials who helped cover up the disappearances or provided legal protection for the network's activities. The most chilling document was a report analyzing the supply chain from religious camps to final destinations. It treated the women like commodities, analyzing which types were most valuable for different purposes and recommending strategies for increasing yield from each location. The report suggested that the operation was providing women not just for prostitution but for private collectors, foreign buyers, and what it euphemistically called specialized services. Martha's hands trembled as she read entries describing women she had known personally, their psychological profiles, their weaknesses, and the specific techniques used to break their resistance. The journal revealed that the spiritual conditioning process was actually a sophisticated form of psychological torture designed to destroy the women's sense of identity and will to resist. But the most horrifying discovery was a detailed plan for what Brother Morai called the final harvest. The summer of 1849 would see the simultaneous closure of 12 camps across 3 states, with all remaining women translated in a coordinated operation. The plan called for the camps to be abandoned, their records destroyed, and their leadership relocated to new territories further west. Martha realized that she had stumbled onto the network's exit strategy. After years of operation, the leadership had decided that the camps were becoming too risky to maintain. Rather than gradually wind down the operation, they planned to eliminate all evidence and witnesses in a single massive operation that would erase hundreds of women from existence. The timeline was immediate. The final harvest was scheduled to begin in just 2 weeks, starting with the New Light Methodist camp. Martha's own name appeared on the priority list, along with the remaining women in the camp who were considered problematic due to their questions or connections to the outside world. As she prepared to leave the chamber with her evidence, Martha heard footsteps approaching the building, but this time they were moving with purpose, not the casual pace of Brother Morai's usual routines. She realized that her presence had been detected, possibly by one of the assistants conducting their patrol rounds. The footsteps stopped outside the chamber's entrance, and Martha heard the low murmur of voices. She was trapped with no way to escape without confronting whoever was outside. The candle in her hand suddenly seemed impossibly bright, and she realized that its light might be visible under the door. As she extinguished the candle, plunging the chamber into complete darkness, Martha heard the unmistakable sound of keys being inserted into the lock. Someone was entering the main room of Brother Morai's quarters, and they would almost certainly discover the hidden chamber. In the darkness, Martha clutched the documents she had gathered, knowing they represented the only evidence that might save the women who were still alive. But she also knew that if she was caught, she would join Catherine and the others in whatever fate awaited those who threatened the operation. The door to the main room opened, and Martha heard Brother Morai's voice, calm and measured. "Sister Martha, I know you're in there. Why don't you come out so we can discuss what you've learned? I think you'll find that your understanding of our holy work is incomplete. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Pennsylvania hills intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when Martha faces the true architect of this nightmare." Martha remained frozen in the darkness of the hidden chamber, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain Brother Morai could hear it through the stone walls. The documents in her hands seemed to burn with the weight of their terrible revelations, and she knew that these papers might be the only chance to expose the network that had consumed hundreds of women. "I understand your confusion, Sister Martha." Brother Morai continued, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used during sermons. "Catherine Miller filled your mind with disturbing interpretations of our sacred work, but she was an agent of darkness sent to test our faith and corrupt our mission. Surely you can see that now." The casual way he mentioned Catherine's name as if she were simply another theological problem to be addressed made Martha's blood run cold. She pressed herself against the far wall of the chamber, trying to stay as far from the entrance as possible while still being able to hear his words. "The work we do here is indeed difficult for earthly minds to comprehend," Brother Morai continued, and Martha could hear him moving around the main room, lighting candles, and settling into his usual routine. "The women we have translated are serving a purpose far greater than their simple minds could have imagined. They are instruments of a divine plan that has been unfolding for centuries." Martha heard the scrape of the chair being moved and realized that Brother Morai was positioning himself between her and the only exit. He wasn't just trying to coax her out. He was preparing for a long conversation, confident that she had nowhere to go. "You see, Sister Martha, the Christian church has been corrupted by sentimentality and false compassion. It has forgotten that God's chosen people are meant to rule over the weak and the inferior. The women, we translate, are not being harmed. They are being elevated to their proper station as servants of their superiors." The casual way he spoke of the women's fate, as if their enslavement was a theological necessity, revealed the depth of his delusion or cynicism. Martha began to understand that Brother Morai genuinely believed in his twisted doctrine, that he saw himself as implementing God's will, rather than simply profiting from human trafficking. "The network you discovered in your unauthorized search represents the restoration of the natural order," he continued. "Throughout history, the strong have ruled the weak, the intelligent have commanded the simple, and the chosen have used the common for higher purposes. Modern society has forgotten these truths, but we are working to restore them." Martha heard papers rustling and realized that Brother Morai was reading from the same documents she had discovered. He was using her own investigation as a teaching tool, explaining the operations philosophy as if she were a student in need of enlightenment. The camps serve as collection points, but also as laboratories for perfecting the translation process. Each woman who passes through our care teaches us more about the most effective methods of spiritual conditioning. The techniques we have developed here are being shared with similar operations across the country and even internationally. The scope of what he was describing horrified Martha beyond anything she had imagined. This wasn't just a local criminal enterprise. It was part of a coordinated effort to restore what Brother Morte saw as the proper social order, with themselves as the natural rulers and women as their property. The final harvest you read about is not an ending, Sister Martha, but a graduation. We have perfected our methods here, and now it is time to expand our work to a national scale. The women who have been translated from this camp have helped us establish operations in 12 major cities with more planned every month. Martha's mind reeled as she realized the true scope of the network. The women weren't just being sold, they were being used to establish new camps and recruitment centers, spreading the operation like a disease across the country. Each translation was actually helping to enslave more women in an ever-expanding web of exploitation. Your nephew Samuel has been particularly helpful in developing our psychological conditioning techniques, Brother Morai continued, and Martha felt a crushing sense of betrayal. His insights into human nature have allowed us to refine our methods considerably. He speaks very highly of your intelligence, which is why you are being offered a choice that others have not received. The sound of footsteps told Martha that Brother Morai was approaching the hidden door. She pressed herself further into the shadows, clutching the documents that represented her only hope of exposing the truth. You can join us willingly, Sister Martha, and help us perfect our work. Your maternal instincts and natural authority would make you valuable in training new recruits. Or you can resist and be processed like the others. But either way, you will serve the greater purpose. The hidden door began to swing open and candlelight flickered into the chamber. Martha saw Brother Morai's silhouette in the doorway, but something was different about his appearance. Gone was the humble religious leader she had known. In his place stood a man whose eyes gleamed with the cold calculation of a predator who had cornered his prey. The choice is yours, Sister Martha, willing servant or unwilling commodity, but you will serve. Martha made her decision in that instant. Rather than submit or attempt to negotiate, she threw herself toward the chamber's only window, a narrow opening she had noticed during her earlier search. The glass shattered as she crashed through it, and she felt sharp pain as the fragments cut her arms and face. She hit the ground hard, her ankle twisting painfully, but adrenaline kept her moving. Behind her, she could hear Brother Morai calling for his assistance, his calm demeanor finally cracking as he realized his prisoner had escaped. Martha ran through the dark forest, following paths she barely knew, guided only by her desperate need to reach the outside world with the evidence she carried. Every shadow seemed to hide one of Brother Morai's men. Every sound suggested pursuit, but she forced herself to keep moving despite the pain in her ankle and the blood flowing from her cuts. As she stumbled through the darkness, Martha heard the sound of horses behind her. The assistants were mounting an organized search, but she also heard something else that gave her hope. Dogs barking in the distance, suggesting that she was approaching the nearest settlement. The race through the forest became a nightmare of endurance and terror. Martha's injured ankle slowed her progress, and she could hear her pursuers getting closer. But the documents in her blood-stained dress represented the testimonies of hundreds of women who could no longer speak for themselves, and she refused to let their suffering be meaningless. When Martha finally stumbled into the town of Clearfield at dawn on June 8, 1849, she was barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion. The town's sheriff, Thomas Mackenzie, initially dismissed her story as the ravings of an injured woman, but when she produced the documents from Brother Morkai's chamber, his attitude changed dramatically. The papers Martha had salvaged included correspondence that mentioned Sheriff Mackenzie by name, describing him as a potential asset who could be brought into cooperation through appropriate incentives. The realization that he was already under surveillance by the network sent Mackenzie into a panic that convinced Martha she had found an ally, but their investigation of the camp 2 days later found only empty buildings and cold ashes. Brother Morai and his assistants had vanished, taking with them any remaining women and all evidence of their activities. The camp had been systematically destroyed, with every record burned and every building stripped of anything that might provide clues to the network's operations. The only evidence that remained was what Martha had carried in her blood-stained dress through the dark forest. And even that was dismissed by state authorities as fabricated or misinterpreted. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office conducted a perfunctory investigation that concluded the camp had been abandoned due to financial difficulties, with the missing women presumably having returned to their families or moved to other communities. But Martha Brennan's desperate flight through the Pennsylvania wilderness had accomplished more than she realized. Unknown to her, Catherine Muller had not been killed when her cover was blown. She had been a federal agent working for a secret government task force investigating reports of organized human trafficking in religious communities. Catherine's real name was Catherine Morrison, and she was part of a small unit within the Treasury Department that had been tracking the network for over 2 years. Her capture by Brother Morai had been planned, allowing her to be taken to one of the network's processing centers in Philadelphia, where she could gather intelligence on the operation's leadership and final destinations. The documents Martha had recovered, combined with Catherine's inside intelligence, provided federal authorities with enough evidence to begin dismantling the network. But the investigation had to be conducted in absolute secrecy, as the operation had corrupted officials at every level of government. Over the following 6 months, federal agents quietly arrested key figures in 12 states, disrupting operations that had enslaved over 400 women since 1845. But the network's leadership, the mysterious J.R., whose letters Martha had discovered, was never identified or captured. The investigation simply stopped, with no official explanation provided to the agents involved. Martha Brennan spent the rest of her life trying to expose the truth about what had happened in the Pennsylvania hills. But her efforts were systematically undermined by forces she never fully understood. Newspapers refused to publish her story. Government officials dismissed her claims, and even churches condemned her wild accusations against men of God. She died in 1867, still fighting to be heard, still carrying the burden of the women whose voices had been silenced forever. Her nephew Samuel disappeared during the federal raids and was never seen again. Brother Mordecai's fate remained unknown, though rumors placed him in California, Oregon, and even overseas, always one step ahead of the law. The official records of the New Light Methodist camp were destroyed in a clerical accident at the Pennsylvania State Archives in 1855. The federal investigation files were classified and remain sealed to this day. The campsite itself was sold to a mining company that stripped the hillside of timber and topsoil, erasing any physical evidence of what had occurred there. But the network Martha had exposed was larger and more resilient than anyone realized. Within 5 years of the federal raids, similar camps were operating in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Western Territories using refined techniques developed through years of experimentation on the women of Pennsylvania. The final harvest that Martha had prevented in 1849 was simply postponed, not canceled. Modern historians who have studied the fragmentary records of religious communities in 19th century America have noted unusual patterns in the demographic data from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia during the 1840s and 1850s. Young women disappeared from census records at rates that cannot be explained by normal migration, marriage, or mortality patterns. The 278 women who vanished from religious camps between 1847 and 1853 represent only the documented cases from a single 3-state region. Federal estimates suggest that the actual number of victims nationwide may have exceeded 2,000, making it one of the largest human trafficking operations in American history. The demolition crew that discovered evidence beneath the New Light Methodist camp in 2019 found fragments of personal items and handwritten notes that corroborated Martha Brennan's testimony. But the site was quickly sealed by federal authorities, and the artifacts were classified under national security provisions that prevent their public examination. The doctrine that Brother Morai preached, the belief that certain people are naturally destined to rule over others, never disappeared. It evolved, adapted, and found new expressions in different eras and different contexts. The techniques of psychological conditioning developed in the Pennsylvania camps were refined and passed down through networks that continue to operate in various forms today. Martha Brennan's courage in exposing the truth saved the lives of dozens of women who would have been consumed by the final harvest. But her larger battle against the forces that see human beings as commodities to be exploited remains unfinished. The shadows she fled through in 1849 still exist, and they still hide predators who wrap their cruelty in the language of faith and righteousness. This mystery shows us how evil can disguise itself as virtue, how isolation can become imprisonment, and how the very institutions we trust for spiritual guidance can become instruments of exploitation. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker truths still hidden in America's religious history? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe. Hit the notification bell and share with someone who loves mysteries. The shadows of the past are still with us, and only by shining light on them can we prevent history from repeating itself. See you in the next video.